The Return of Light. Revelations from the Creator God Horus.
Chapter 3, The Light Workers. Some time after our creation had been invaded by the dark beings, plans were made to heal and counteract the damage. The first plan was put into place about 500 million years ago. At this time, the true intent of the dark forces had not been revealed, and it was thought that they were innocently harming the universes into which they had spread. Therefore, the first major attempt to help the fallen universes involved the sending of a substantial force of light beings into each of the universes that had been affected. These light beings were mostly from the inner universes, the older ones which are located nearest the Godverse, and which are closest to the pristine purity and power of the original creation. The beings who were sent were healers, restorers, and educators, for it was then believed that the invading beings could be helped and restored to the divine flow of life in this creation. Most of the light workers on Earth belong to this group, and therefore most of us have been in this particular universe for about 500 million years. The light workers are generally characterized by a high degree of awareness, along with a profound longing for home. There were many aspects to this initial plan. The one I am most familiar with involved the bringing of pure, uncorrupted genetic or blueprint material from the Godverse to a selected number of critical planets in those universes which had damaged genetics. As you read this section, you may come to a remembrance of your intended part in this great plan. The mission of the light workers. Heru, please give some additional information on the group of light workers, which was sent about 500 million years ago to help the dark universes. We'd like to know what prompted this group of beings to come, who made the decisions, how they were chosen or how they volunteered, and so on.
The creator gods in the fallen universes convened a council. They met and put forth a call for help. This call went out and a great council was convened amongst the creator gods of the light universes. An extensive recruitment then took place to assemble a large entourage of multi-skilled, multifaceted, multidimensional beings to come and do what they thought would be reclamation work. It was hoped that the size and skills of this force would be sufficient. This force arrived into the universes which had been affected by darkness, and at first things seemed to be going well. They set up their schools, their healing missions, and so on, all of the work that they felt would be needed. Some thousands of years into this project, the dark achieved a critical mass, declared itself, and sealed off this quadrant of universes behind the frequency fence. And essentially at that point the battles began.
What kind of numbers were sent into a universe such as this one?
Hundreds of thousands of beings were sent into each universe. This venture was considered very important, and the recruiting effort was large. It went across pretty much the entire spectrum of talents and beings. At that time it was still believed that the dark beings could be helped, and so the light workers that were sent were chosen as healers, restorers, teachers, and so on.
Would you speak on some of the other major facets of the plans and purposes of these light forces? I feel this is important because light workers reading this material may remember the reasons for which they came here.
Yes. I would suggest to each of the light workers who come to read this to look at their passion and their talents. For instance, if someone has a passion for Akashic record work or healing work, to look at that, and see it as the seed of the mission they came here to accomplish. It will also be helpful to realize that great numbers of people with similar talents and similar missions were sent into each universe. For example, perhaps several thousand people with the great ability of Akashic record reclamation would go into each dark universe and be stationed throughout. Then there would have been the intention to link up with a being in the healing arts, or a being doing genetic work, or whatever. And these different groups would have worked hand in hand, and put together a comprehensive program for healing not only individuals, but worlds and systems. Since your personal work involved biosystems, for instance, you would have worked with geneticists, and would have also worked with beings who specialized in cleaning up various types and levels of pollution. Then there would have been the teachers, the educators, those who specialized in emotional and spiritual work, and so on. These beings then began to set up something almost along the lines of a great university on each planet, so you would have a whole university-type structure of classes on healing and other subjects, which would be coordinated from a centralized location. Since there are many inhabited planets in each of the fallen universes, A teacher or healer would be assigned to many, not just one. Remember that wormhole travel at that time was very possible, though it has largely broken down since then. Parts of this great system were actually set up within the universes before everything was totally disrupted.
Are the remains of this original force of light workers now concentrated on the 12 critical planets? Please see the glossary for a definition of the 12 critical planets, of which Earth is one.
There are remains on each of those planets. However, these areas have been targeted by the dark forces, so many have fled to some safer areas. There are some of these beings in that area where your relatives are, near the edge of this universe. Those who could flee to safety did so. However, many were entrapped in the karmic cycle of this planet or wherever they were at the time.
Please discuss briefly what it was like for us when the fall happened, knowing nothing of darkness or even of defending ourselves.
It was horrible beyond words. If you were to look at some of the sections of Michelangelo's fresco, of the Last Judgment, and you look at the fallen souls, it would look something like that, only magnified many hundreds of thousands of times. The light workers and other beings in these universes were trapped, and ripped asunder from their connectedness with Prime Creator, and also their connectedness with all their companions. There was the rending apart of twin souls, and many other connections were also torn apart. For example, those who don't have twin souls would have their connection to nature severed, or their connection to the Creator gods, or to Prime Creator, severed or twisted. It was like a descent into hell.
Have many of us attempted to return home, and have we been unable to do so?
I would say just about everybody who has any consciousness left has desired to go home, but most have had no way to do so.
Did a high percentage of the light workers fall?
Even one being falling is a high percentage. But I would say in the range of 30% fell. And I believe that most or all of these beings will be reclaimed.
How did you, yourself, resist the temptation to fall?
In my own case, I never felt the temptation or the lure of whatever it is that the darkness has offered, and so for me resistance has not been difficult in that way. It is the only thing I know, to be of light and to be of service.
Is it correct that the vast majority of light workers on this planet are from the original group who came into the fallen universes to help?
That is correct. And it is the light workers, collectively, who have taken the greatest brunt of this destruction. For you simultaneously fell victim to the controlling nature of the darkness, and yet could see that this was not the true nature of humanity, for you had your memories intact. So this has been, for all of you, the roughest ride.
Is there anything you would like to convey to the light workers?
I would like to say that the remnants of the families, or the groups that people came in with are here. The time is right for people to seek each other out, through whatever means is available, in terms of like-minded groups and conversations with people who have similar passions. They may wish to form discussion groups, either in person or through the internet. There can be a sharing of experiences with no agenda, simply trying to jog each other's memories and come up with common experiences. The other thing I would like to say is that the beings who came into this project were considered the best, and the brightest within the creation, representing a cross-section of all of the kinds of talents of all the Creator gods, across all the universes. They were not Creator gods specifically, but they were representatives of their particular brands of creation, in a sense.
It must have been a loss to the rest of creation, then, to have their best and brightest lost for so long.
Yes, and I would also like to say that I believe all will be reclaimed. It is my hope that even those who were lost or melted down can be restored, and there are relatively few of those.
Why are these beings from the older universes the finest and brightest souls? Are we just older?
Well, that's perhaps a qualitative judgment on my part, a preference on my part. It's maybe not fair of me to say finer and brighter, but they are among my favorites.
What would be the difference between one of these beings and one from an outer universe?
It would be like the difference between an ancient wise tree and a young sapling.
Please give some further information about the particular aspect of this work that has made Earth so important, that of selecting 12 critical planets and seeding perfect genetic material into them.
That was seen as part of the rescue mission, as it was seen that the genetics of the fallen universes had been corrupted and damaged. At that time, it was not known that the forces of darkness were so adamantly bent on destruction and control. It was thought that they were wayward and were innocently damaging the creation, not through evil intent but just through being in an inharmonious state. It was not seen to be a consciously driven attempt at destruction, more a byproduct of their flawed nature. Therefore, it was felt that if perfect genetic material could be reintroduced into the fallen universes, then their genetics and their blueprints could be corrected. The further that you get from the God-verse, the center of the universes, the more and more flaws and divergence you get from the original, perfected blueprint of life. Therefore, the universes that are furthest from the God-verse are the ones where these flaws have multiplied and magnified. It's similar to the way that DNA will form new cells, but as it multiplies hundreds and thousands of times, flaws develop and then perpetuate themselves and increase. What you and your group did was to take original material from the divine blueprint, material taken from very near the center of things, and bring it way out to the edge of creation, to this critical point which is Earth. These critical planets were carefully chosen as they form a grid within the universe. In each of the outer universes, in fact some of the closer-in ones as well, there has been this embedding of key points. In the fallen universes they have been fought over greatly, and have been the source of many of the wars, because control of these key points means control of the light coming in. However, the original flaws in the outer universes would have been easily corrected, had not the dark forces taken advantage of them to damage, corrupt, and destroy the genetics and blueprints in the fallen universes. One of the most damaging results of the invasion was the fall or taking down of some of the creator gods. For each universe is created by a being or beings. Therefore, as the creator gods were corrupted, what they brought forth was faulty DNA and faulty structures and so on. For what is not created in light is an abomination. The fallen creator gods created universes which are almost entirely dark and devoid of light.
Was the perfect genetic material in the 12 key planets being held for the future?
There are two aspects here. There were beings who brought in genetic material to restore that which was damaged. Your mission was somewhat different in that it came somewhat later, as a last gasp effort to retain the integrity of things before it was lost.
And do you still believe that this perfect genetic material from the 12 critical planets will be able to restore the damaged genetics in this universe?
It is quite likely, yes. It looks to be still doable.
For those of us who have been here in the fallen universes, has there been any benefit?
The benefit is of endeavoring to save that portion of creation from being overtaken by the darkness. There is a great benefit there. The great heroics of the beings who have come here have not gone unsung, and the service that has been rendered is very appreciated. These beings become great teachers, and in doing so serve the light mightily.